we just saw what coding standards and best practices are and what purpose it serves. Now, when it comes to these coding standards and style guides, every technology or every programming language has a specific coding standard, and you have references to look at on the web. When it comes to HTML and CSS, everyone or every other big corporation, all the unicorn companies and the top IT firms will look for Google standards. We'll see what those are. Google standards for HTML, CSS. So this is the link. Now, when it comes to HTML, CSS, all the MNCs and all the IT firms will follow Google standard, so that when you use a reference code from a common repository, or when programmers move from one organization to other organization, everyone will follow the same standard. So that is why for every programming language, there is one popular standard to follow. So for React, see React style guide, this firm called Airbnb. Airbnb is an application where you can book houses for vacation. So Airbnb's IT team, they have a style guide, and that style guide makes sense, and they were more popular. So every other company uses Airbnb's style guide. Likewise, you would have something for Java, Python, and all the other programming languages too. Now, let's look at what Google says about the coding standards. Now, they've also claimed the same. It aims at improving collaboration among team members, code quality, and enabling supporting infrastructure. Now, to begin with, they say that whenever you use a script tag or whenever you import something like the say Google Fonts, always go for HTTPS. HTTPS is pretty much a security layer that's added to HTTP. We will have more videos about what these HTTPS and HTTP are, these protocols. Now it's just to make sure it is safe. Again, that's what we discussed in coding standard, right? So coding standard also ensures security. Now, the other thing they focus on HTML, CSS is the formatting rules, which is the indentation by 2 spaces. Now, what happens in indentation is, now let's see, you give 4 spaces. Generally, in other programming languages, you will give 4 spaces. But in HTML, there is so much of property that when you keep writing your code in one sentence, it will just keep growing to the end. Like it will just, think about it. When it goes across, what happens is you have to keep scrolling your horizontal bar. You don't want to do that when doing a code. When writing a code, you don't have to scroll horizontally. You could obviously scroll vertically. I mean, without this, you can't go to the next lines of code, right? So this horizontal scrolling is fine. Sorry, the vertical scrolling is fine, but the horizontal scrolling is not okay at all. So in that case, the 2 indentation makes sense, or else if you make 4 indentation, so 4 indentation here, the next the child would have another 4, then another 4, another 4. So if you keep just moving it, the indentation itself will take so much of space, and the code will keep pushing to the right side. So what happens is so much of code goes on the right side and you have to horizontally scroll. So we don't want to do that. So that's why 2 indentation makes sense. And even in CSS, 2 indentation makes sense. And capitalization in HTML and CSS, the tags and the properties and the CSS names all should be in small. So this is one language where we make sure that all the properties and the tags are all in small. Capitalization is not allowed. Use only lowercase. Trailing white spaces. What is trailing white space? Now let's see here. I just clicked on space bar and there's a space here. Now this is not acceptable at all, because even the space is pretty much stored in your code. So that might take a byte, and this might, if you give another space, that might take a byte. Now if you think of hundreds of files in your project, just think of how much of bytes it adds. So much of bytes added also takes space. So when you browse for a site, now when you browse for a site, that file is downloaded, right? That HTML file is downloaded. So if it is extra 1 KB, obviously it's going to take some time. So it's better to not have any extra spaces. And at the same time, there's something called diffs. Now diff is when you compare your code to your next version of code. Like let's say you make some changes now, and you want to compare your code to see if there is any change, and this space and all will be such an unnecessary difference. Now by diff it only means difference. So sometimes you will just compare your code like this. You would compare your code like this, seeing your previous version of code and what changes you made. But if you have any spaces, all that, so that will also be a difference, and that is all unnecessary. So we don't want that. In comments, they say like use comments, explain code as needed, but I would say your naming conventions, whatever naming convention you use, whatever in language you use, all these naming conventions should be self-explanatory. You don't have to comment it everywhere to explain what you're doing. So that becomes like a two-layer process, right? You have to look at the code, and for that to be understood, you have to look at the comment again. So that is something not necessary at all. So instead have these ID names and all that and class names to be more meaningful in the sense, I mean it should say what it does. That should be there. So I would say avoid comment as much as possible. And this is an interesting part. Mark to do's an action item with to do. So what is done is, let's say you have designed, but you are not completely satisfied with the design, but you have to deliver this code to client, or publish this code to the outside world. So you might say something like this. Just put a comment here. Now this is the syntax they want us to maintain, to do, and say make this div even better. So these are all like statements you make to make sure that, I mean, the next time you visit this page, you see that this comment is there, and you know that this has to be worked better, that once upon a time you thought this wasn't the best way to do it, and it has to be even better. So you could make those changes better. So it's basically like a reminder for you, a reminder with a checklist. Now we saw that doc type HTML, and for the doc type HTML is something that they want to be mentioned so that the browser knows this is really necessary. So the browser knows that whether it is a HTML5 or other syntax, so that the HTML could optimize your code or perform better. Then you have HTML validity. So this says use valid HTML wherever possible. Now look at it. The title and the article, it's there, but this doc type HTML and meta charset UTF is also important, and this is important so that it ensures proper HTML usage. Now about the meta charset UTF-8, we'll have a separate video to explain this. Okay, semantics. Now use the tags appropriately. Now anchor tag is for clicking, like, so use anchor tag for that instead of using a div tag. Now, even in div tag, you can have a on click and then go to recommendations is a function. This is a JavaScript function where you could write what or where it has to be taken to. But div is not a link at all, right? That is not its purpose. In that case, if you use div, browser will not know how to optimize it better. So if it's something is intended for link, if anchor is intended for link, use anchor tag. If something else is intended for div, use a div. So make sure it is used appropriately. We saw in one of the image videos that if the image is not available, have an alt tag, so that if the image is not available, the user will know what or what was supposed to be there. And this also actually helps in SEO. SEO is search engine optimization. When you Google something, like say you want a spreadsheet screenshot, when you say spreadsheet screenshot, all these images that you see in Google, this is from a website, obviously, right? Now in that website, this image will have an alt property that says, let's see what it says. Copy picture intros for this image. But what was the image we clicked? We clicked on, this is the image we clicked. I hope so. Or it all this these all looks like the same images. But if you the point is the alt is what you will find in these images. Now these images, they would have given alt equal to the spreadsheet screenshot. So that's how it helps. Now separation of concerns. When it comes to coding, you have to make sure that a single file should have its purpose. You shouldn't have like multiple purpose in one file. At the same time, make sure that every purpose is covered in a single file. Now, if you just look at it, the style sheet should be separate, and then that's what it says, right? Keep structure, the markup, HTML should be separate, styling, CSS should be separate, and the scripting, which is the behavior or the JavaScript, should be separate. All this should be separate. Now, looks like Google also recommend that instead of having 3 CSS, maintain just one CSS, which would be easier to organize CSS. Now entity references. Now symbols like these were not available earlier. So we will use when you write something in HTML like this ampersand, LEQO or euro, and this you would get this. So the EOR is pretty much the symbol, and this is the quotes. Okay, so instead of doing that, Google recommends have the symbol itself. Now it's possible with your latest OS and VS Code approaches. Optional tags. We saw on the skeleton video that the HTML head this is all skeleton, and body this is all skeleton. But the browser really understands that when there is a title, the HTML and head is not required at all. And when it looks at something like paragraph, it knows that it is a body. When it looks for title, it knows that it is part of head. So you don't need to mention the HTML head and the body tag and this closing HTML tag. The reason is just to avoid optional tags. And I saw this mentioned somewhere for file or size optimization, like how we saw the avoiding spaces. Now even this takes some bytes, right? So you could avoid those bytes. Now you might think, I mean, how much of hurt the browser performance is going to take. But if you think about it, you not just have uh, a single HTML, you might have multiple HTML, and sometimes you will embed HTMLs, and this would actually come into handy when you think about React.js, all those frameworks. But then whatever you could save from loading, it's actually better for performance. And then Google also recommend not to use type equal to text CSS. This is something that I have seen many users use it, but we haven't used it in any of our videos, so we avoid that, even in style sheet and even in JavaScript. So that's a very good thing to do. And avoid unnecessary ID attributes, prefer class. So we saw this in which selector to use better in that video. So whenever we need to apply styles, it's better to use classes than IDs, because IDs are very unique, and in one page, if you have like 10 HTML elements to apply CSS for, you need to have 10 IDs, whereas class, whichever elements has the same properties, needs the same design properties, you could use class for them. So it's better that way. And use a new line for every block. So for every tag that you open, the next tag should be fresh. So that's what they have maintained here. So don't have the li next to ul. So it should be the same. And this is a very important thing that I see many front-end developers miss. So the width should be 80 columns. That's 80 columns in the sense 1, 1, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, likewise 80 columns. You don't see, but you don't see in your code, in your VS code, how this 80 columns is measured or till where it is measured. So you might not have an idea about that. So that's where in VS code you have something in settings called editor.ruler. Now there you have to just go and give a value here 80. Now if I give the value 80 here, see this line appears. Now this makes sure I make sure that every time I write code, it shouldn't pass as 80. Now the reason for this is 80 is where you would see the whole code, right? Now I have changed my resolution of my Mac. That's why this is all zoomed in. Now when it is not zoomed in, you can obviously see this line. So developer to developer, say every developer has this 80 line rule, and you move from one Mac to the another Mac, or one Mac to another Windows to Mac, whatever it is, you would obviously see, whoever looks at it, whichever programmer in your team looks at it, he would be able to see the code without scrolling. So this piece of code is not allowed. So 80 is accepted space. So make sure that when you code, you have the ruler in space. So just have this ruler in space. 80 is already there. Just have this ruler in space so that you see this ruler whenever you code, and make sure that you don't exceed this code, so that this code is viewed in the single view without scrolling the horizontal page for any of your programmers. Because some programmers, they might even have a wide screen at their home. They might want to write the code to the extent of this, like say like even 200 columns they want to write, and looking at their wide screen monitor. But what happens when he shares this piece of code to someone else? In that case, that person has to keep scrolling in the horizontal page. But whereas the initial coder, for him to look at his wide monitor, he doesn't have to scroll. So it should be standard across a team. So that's why it is 80 line ruler. So when it comes to places like say this HTML, right? When it comes to HTML, what happens is sometimes it might just grow like here. So it might just grow till 80. So what happens is Google recommends one of these 4 patterns. I would recommend this pattern. There's a reason for that. If you see the indentation is button, this is all button properties, right? Now after button, color, class, all that is there. Now he just does a 2 indentation, but 2 indentation is something that I have maintained for the next elements. So for that, what you could do is button, then have a property, then just bring it to that properties alignment. So everything has to be in that alignment. Now this you could do constantly for all your elements or your tags, or I mean it's better to do it for all your elements instead of having it for some elements like full all the way, and for some elements just having like this. So it's better to have it for all the elements, apply the same tag style. Now, and then you could start your child element after like 2 indentations. And then there is quotation marks. Always use quotation marks, double quotation marks, not the single quotation marks. I would want you to reserve single quotation marks for JavaScript, not in HTML, CSS. Now, CSS style rules, and use valid CSS where possible, and use proper syntax. But when it comes to class naming, never say what this element is. Never say it is a button, never say it is a link, or never say it is a this color or whatever style it is. The reason is, if you are trying to give this property, a class name to say a div tag, you don't have to say green, because sometimes probably in future you might want to change this as blue. So that should be blue is the property, right? So just give it inside. The blue has to be blue, or green has to be the values inside. It shouldn't be the name itself. Now the names should obviously be functional names. It shouldn't be on the properties of it. So that's what it does. Gallery, login, video. So gallery is basically a functional name, right? It is not a property. It doesn't say long gallery. It doesn't say green gallery. So it should be in that way. Now class name style. Use class names as small as possible. Yes, but you have to make sure that class names are self-understandable. So someone to just read this class name, they have to understand it. If it is not understandable with short names, or say a single word, have 2 words. Now these 2 words have to be in lowercase, separated by a hyphen. A hyphen is best. These are all not accepted, because sometimes 2 words you might not know. I mean, immediately looking at it, I know this is adds a simple separate word, and sample is a separate word. But when you look at demo image, you have to, I mean, it takes like a microseconds to perceive that demo is separate, image is separate, but this is better. Why we don't use underscore is, sometimes what happens is, whenever we read something, I mean, at a few places there's an underline, and the underscore, it's something that merges with underline. We are not able to understand that. So prefix selectors, when it comes to prefix selectors, we have a session with that. So when you do this prefix selectors, also follow by a hash. We'll see in the selectors, we have a separate session for that. We'll see that there. And type selectors, avoid qualifying class names with type selectors. Now we saw in the last few videos that sometimes this is the practice, you give the tag name and then the class name. This is really not necessary. You would better give the class name alone. So this is very unnecessary, and avoid unnecessary answers selectors for performance reasons. Yes, you could simply give the class name alone. It's all the same. Even if you say ul.example, it will look for the ul that has example class, or even if you just say example, it will look for the all the tags with the example class. Obviously you might have given it for the ul. The purpose is the same. ID selectors, avoid ID selectors. Now we saw earlier, using ID selectors, you have to have like so many IDs and then so many ID selectors being mentioned in the class file. So and the CSS file will be a huge file. Shorthand properties. We have shorthand properties for everything. We have for font family, we font family and font size all can be included as font. Padding for all four can be done in single value, and then you have borders. Yeah, borders can also be done separately. But if it is not necessary, having four values instead of one would make more sense. Sometimes we give zero values, and it is recommended that after zero values, don't say pixel, em, or anything. Don't use any units unless for the flex. For the flex alone, it is recommended to use pixels after that. It looks like it is needed in Internet Explorer 11. So you have to think about all the browsers, not just Chrome browser. Now, even though Google recommends the style guide, Google also want their websites to be seen properly in all the browsers. So even they keep that in mind. Cross browsers compatibility is something they keep that in mind. Okay, instead of giving just 0.8, give 0.8, and so decimal values always give a leading zero. That gives a better perception. So the point is to the human brain to perceive immediately. So human brain can actually perceive immediately when it looks at 0.8, because if the values are from 0 and 1, it knows that the range is from 0 and 1. So 0.1 to 0.9 and 1.0 makes more sense. So it is faster to perceive. 3-character hexadecimal instead of 6 characters. Now in some hexadecimal, this is red, green and blue. Now instead of giving two E's, you could give a single E and single B and single C. When say if you need a variation, you might give a F here. But if you actually think about it, the variation is very minute and it's hardly marginal. The human eye can't see the differences between EFBBCC and EBBCC. So but in some cases you are so rigid, or you say your client is so rigid about the colors, probably you can have the 6 digits, or else always prefer to have 3 digits. Important declarations. There's something called this important that I haven't covered yet. This comes in my video called specificity. It's in one of my future videos. So this should be avoided at any cost. This shouldn't even come in rare cases. So kindly avoid this. Now, there are some CSS hacks that comes in the sense you could actually try to detect what browser it is and make some hacks. Kindly avoid that. See, it has to be the code has to be as simple as possible so that the browser understands the code. And let's say the browser keeps updating, right? Chrome gets updated every now and then, at least weekly, twice I see an update. So Chrome knows how to optimize all these elements, how to make these elements perform better. In that sense, if you hack these in future, there might be a probability that Google takes an update, and that update's benefit is not reaped in your application or your website. So for those reasons, it's better not to do those CSS hacks. CSS formatting rules, alphabetized declarations. Now, in terms of properties, like say, give these in the alphabetical order. So B, C, T is in alphabetical order. Even here, it's a B. These are all prefix. These are all not properties. So let's not consider this. Just consider this part. So it's better to alphabetize this. Now, the reason they were asking to alphabetize is to achieve consistent code in a way that is easy to learn, remember, and manually maintain. So if throughout your application everyone has been doing the declaration in order, it makes sense for anyone to just look at it. Let's say I mean, this looks very simple, right? You have just like 8 properties now, but sometimes you will even have like 20 properties. In that sense, you don't want to just scroll and see where is my border, whether it's in the top or in the middle and the bottom. So in that case, you don't want to do that. So CSS should be that effective. Now let's see, you even see here, I mean, there's so much of CSS. I mean, I don't have to go and look here and there, where is my border. See, the border is not there. This is not the right code. This is an ugly code, I would say. So it has to be in the order. Now immediately you want to look at something, I mean, you could do it in like microseconds. That's how it is. So the relationship or the communication with your Mac or your PC or a Visual Studio Code should be instant. So it should be like you talk to them. So there shouldn't be things like I have to search or see where it is, all that. It shouldn't be there. And this block content, so we will see this in the upcoming videos, where we have these rules and block content that also should have some indentation, is what it's trying to say here. And declaration stops all the time. In all the declaration have a semicolon, even if it is the last item. So the last item also needs a semicolon. The property name stops. Use a space after a property name's colon. So property name, there is a colon, but there's no space, but there has to be a space. So this separation, all the separation, what it makes is immediately when you look at it, I mean, your brain perceives faster. So that's the point. I mean, a programmer should never think about the syntax or say keep looking at all this, searching the code, all that. So he should be able to communicate with the code or your editor without any hindrance. So declaration block separation. Now this, right, this has to, there has to be a space here. That's what is recommended. And don't start this from the next line. This is unnecessary. You can start it from here because this line itself says it's a starting. Along with the video, it makes sense. So that's what it is here now. Selector and declaration separation. Now this and this, obviously these are all say have the same properties as the same here, but you should know that it has been grouped. I mean, when we just keep scrolling the code file, sometimes we might ignore these. So that is why it is better to group, I mean, have these groups one by one, so that when you look at it, you know that there is a place where we have grouped and all these 3 items, classes or a whatever selector it is, takes the common properties. Rule separation. Separate rules by new lines. Now this is what is recommended. CSS quotation marks. CSS also recommends that use single rather than double quotation marks for attribute selectors and property values alone. Now the property values here, you would see that even VS Code, obviously it takes single code automatically. So for these property values, make sure you give single quotes. And when you are importing a URL, you don't need to use quotation marks, because it is this is actually a function. So the function understands, and the URL doesn't has any spaces. So in that cases, a single line or conjoined text, conjoined letters makes sense. There is no quotation marks required. Quotation marks is really required when we have like 2 words. That's the reason why quotation marks came in. But then functions like these, it knows it is going to be string, so you don't have to give a single quote or a double quote because URL doesn't has any spaces. CSS meta rules: group sections by a section comment. If possible, group style sheet sections together by using comments. Now, let's say we have a number of CSS, right? Now, when we have a number of CSS, it is better to have a heading. So this is a comment, but this comment says that this is a header. Now, Google could have actually added multiple classes to show that this is basically grouping. So this means that when there is a header, all the header related CSS are here. When there is a footer, all the footer related CSS are here. And for gallery, all the gallery related CSS are here. So the classes are here. No, that's the point, right? So it provides, I mean, where do you want to search for? So you don't have to search for this. Grouping would actually help a lot. Now, I would want you to consider this when you do this exercise. Just keep this in mind and always try to use these standards. Now, standards itself is a habit. If you don't use these standards every time that you do, I mean, I don't want you to code first and then change for the standard. That's not the way it is, because you won't have the patience to change it during your project when you get a job, when you actively deliver something. So you wouldn't do that. So then it won't be a habit. Make this as a habit. The moment you code, spend some time for naming variables. So when you want to name a variable, even a class name or whatever it is, you take some time. I mean, naming variables isn't like 5 seconds work. Sometimes it even takes 5 minutes work. Sometimes there's a whole argument between the team. So the team sometimes might even fight for these naming variables. So these naming variables are really important. This is what avoids you not, I mean, commenting it, right? So you don't need a comment to say that this is a company header. Instead, you could have a proper naming that says this is a company header. So that's how your name should be. Now, all these standards, best practices, this is all to maintain harmony among your team. Make sure that how fast you perceive someone else's code, it is the same way someone else should also be able to perceive your code at a rapid speed. Now that's what we aim to accomplish with the coding standards and best practices. Now, this is often ignored, but I'll tell you, the moment you write, I mean, you might be a topper in algorithms, but if you don't name your variables right, and your interviewer or your boss looks at it, I mean, he knows that you're a crappy coder. He knows you're a crappy programmer. So avoid that mistake. When you look at it, we will be doing this exercise, right? We'll be doing the exercise. When someone looks at your code, he should feel, I mean, that he's looking at an art. So it should look like an art. So make sure when you code, the code is something that looks like such a beauty. I mean, it should be perceivable by anyone. It shouldn't look like the ones you see in your hacker movies. So, best of luck. Try to do this exercise, and please do follow your coding standards and the best practices.